Okay, so I'm talking about some shared work today. I'm talking on behalf of a very big group of people, and we're constantly evolving, so hopefully everyone's name is up there. I'm talking about a small piece of this work. I am not at all qualified to talk about some of the stuff done by my colleagues, but their names are there if you want to talk to them more about their pieces of what we've been working on. The project's called Mitigating Zoonotic Disease Risk in Shared Landscapes Through Transdisciplinary Action Research. We're doing work right now in Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, and Rwanda. I'll talk about the Kenya work because that's where we're furthest along at the moment. And in all the landscapes where we're working what we're calling shared landscapes. So landscapes where there's people, pastoralists largely, wildlife, and livestock living together. So my plan is to tell you a little bit about the context we're working in, what brought us together, what we're trying to do, and where we are in our work. And then I'll finish by talking about some challenges and opportunities that we have emerging. So to begin with, this might all be common knowledge to a lot of us now. We know a lot more about zoonotic disease than we did 5 years ago, unfortunately. But maybe that's not a word you're familiar with. So let me just give a bit of context. Zoonotic diseases are diseases that transmit between people and animals. And animal diseases, which we're also interested in, are the ones that just stick to animals, but may move from wildlife to livestock. And in a lot of the world's most biodiverse hotspots, such as where we work in Kenya, these diseases are really, really common. They create a lot of risk for people and animals. They cause economic loss. They cause people to have to give up their livelihood options, and they also hurt biodiversity. So they're pretty important. Although we're used to these diseases, they're becoming more and more common, and yet our ability to deal with them or to prevent their spread is quite limited. So we have a lot of ideas about how to stop disease from spreading. A lot of these ideas are from, the early 1900s, but they don't often work very well, or they work for some groups and not others. So this is things like fences to try to keep wildlife away from livestock and people. And this could work to stop some diseases, but not others, like vector-borne. Mosquitoes can fly across fences. It also interrupts movement of migratory patterns of people and wildlife. So there's these ecological knock-on effects of trying to stop disease spread through fences. Quarantine zones are commonly used, but that requires people to not have to move their livestock for mobility reasons. So they have to be wealthier. So only the wealthy can benefit from these. It also can put a lot of restrictions on trade if you're not in a quarantine zone. So all of the ways we try to mitigate these diseases are not super effective. Especially in these biodiversity hotspots. And they often tend to be quite siloed as well, with some actors a lot better resourced than others to stop the spread of disease. And this creates inequality between where we work, at least in the wildlife sector, and the domestic animal sector. And this all results in a lot of conflicting interests between people that keep livestock for their livelihoods and wildlife officials, conservancies, people that want to protect wildlife. There's this ongoing tension with both groups, knowing that the other is partly responsible for the diseases they face that maybe lower wildlife population numbers or cause people to lose their herds. And no side has a better solution, but both blame each other. And so where we work in particular in Kenya, this has resulted in really growing tensions, and sometimes that escalates into violence and conflict because both groups just feel like the other group is responsible for the disease outbreaks. While these are really important problems in the local context where we work, we now also know these are important problems globally. So stopping the spread and spillover of zoonotic disease is something that affects us all. When we look at this map, we can see that the places where diseases are most likely to emerge are these biodiversity hotspots, often where people, livestock, and wildlife all live together. But when they spill over and spread, they affect us everywhere. So there's a really important need to come up with better solutions that work for everyone. And that's what we've been trying to do with our UMRI funding and now some additional funding we have. So the project has involved we've begun by working in central Kenya. And it has kind of a fun story of how it started. So I'll just tell you a little bit of background. I've worked for the past 10 years in the orange part of the map, which is more towards the north of central Kenya. And these are largely pastoral rangelands, so places where people keep livestock and move across long distances. Suzanne Schultz in FSE has worked in this area for 20 years, but all of her work historically has been confined to these green areas. These are really large private ranches and conservancies, some of the most elite conservancies in the world, so places where royalty go to see wildlife. They're beautiful spaces. They're very exclusive. They're amazing places to do wildlife research, but they tend to fully exclude livestock. So we've been working in the same landscape. We hadn't met each other, but both of us from our own side of the story were very aware of these kind of irretractable problems on both sides. So for me, I'm often hearing from pastoralists about the problems that their livestock face because of growing wildlife populations. For Suzanne, she's heard about these problems that are always blamed on pastoralists. So my research has looked at a few different things. One, what types of tools and strategies do pastoralists have in their toolkit based on Indigenous knowledge for coping with disease? A lot of this relates to seasonal movement, so moving from one place to another when disease starts to spread, and that movement's being stopped by wildlife conservancies. Some of my work has also looked at how environmental change is driving new types of disease outbreaks. So although pastoralists might have had a lot of skills in dealing with certain diseases in the past, for example, been really efficient with manual tick removal, so just pulling off ticks by hand all day, often. Now, all of a sudden, the types of vectors they see facing their animals are changing because of environmental change, and it's a lot harder to pull off mosquitoes than ticks. So these types of environmental trends and changes that mean that the toolkit that pastoralists have had for coping with disease is changing, and also the land barriers they face prevent them from being able to use their strategies. Suzanne's been working, as I said, in the protected areas. I'm not going to try to talk well about her work, but I can just say a little bit briefly. She's done two things. One, she studies the protected area paradox. So why, even though we have more expanding land put aside for wildlife conservation in places like central Kenya, do you still have animal populations really struggling and often dying of disease? What's causing that? And then the second piece is eco-immunology perspective. So looking for immune markers within animals that suggest that there's an infection, even if they're not displaying outward signs of infection. And so both of us have been working in this landscape for quite a while. We met each other and we started talking about the fact that we're both working on the same problem, but from very different perspectives. We both also blame different actors, just like the stakeholders we work with, for the same issue. So is there a way to try to find a common solution? And to start finding a common solution, the first step has been figuring out what is the shared problem. And can we reframe this for people that we work with as a shared problem that we all face together and can solve together, rather than a problem that is from someone out there? It's someone else's problem. So this is our framing, particularly in the context of climate change. Health concerns are rampant. That includes all these host of health concerns we see arising in the places where we work. Endemic zoonotic diseases, such as those caused by intestinal parasites, are a leading cause of ill health and morbidity for people and livestock. That's particularly for young children or people with weakened immune systems. Although there's no research to say this, or very, very little research, Suzanne's lab's working on this, the impact of East Africa's wildlife population is likely to be impacted negatively by the same diseases that affect livestock. So we don't actually have the evidence to show that wildlife populations are declining because of these endemic zoonotic diseases, but we can guess they are. If cattle and goats and sheep are dying from these diseases, probably wildlife populations are as well. And surveillance of these diseases remains really rare in East Africa's rangelands, and it could provide a shared solution to the challenges faced by people, livestock, and wildlife. So that's our framing. Based off that framing, we formed a transdisciplinary network across the University of Manchester, the University of Nairobi, and several other partners in different sectors. So this includes county vets, wildlife authorities, non-governmental organizations, and community leaders and elders. Particularly in Kenya, these are groups that don't talk on a rarely basis. And if they're talking about problems, conflict, and violence. They don't talk in a way that is going to often lead to solutions. So this has been, I'll come back to this, but the biggest challenge we faced, because these are now century-old problems between these groups. And so the first step has been getting everyone in a room and talking about what the solutions might be. Together, we've collaboratively designed and piloted, or we are right now piloting, 2 novel approaches for improving surveillance of endemic zoonotic diseases in wildlife, livestock, and people. Just to quickly look through the timeline, this is still very much in works. We applied in 2022 for UMRI. We weren't successful the first time around. We got a small early career award, or I did at that point. The next year we applied for UMRI again with a better defined project, and we're successful. We began doing a participatory epidemiology study, which I'll come back to shortly. This year we got Darwin funding, which is from DEFRA, in order to build out our UMRI work in 2 different case study sites. We also got ISPF to begin looking at water disease specifically, which Suzanne's lab's doing. We've done partnership meetings and site visits to decide on our methods that we're going to pilot this year with partners. Those meetings have been a huge success in and of themselves, just getting people into the same room to agree on what we're going to try out. And then next year, we're going to move forward with all of the kind of core parts of our work, but we've begun some of this. So I'm not going to talk about 2. I'm just going to talk about the first method that we're piloting. And this is community-led syndromic surveillance of animal health. So this is a method that's not altogether new. In this part of Kenya, there's been attempts to use community-led surveillance of livestock health, and that's been done through apps that are used for community members and pastoralists to report on the health of their animals on a regular basis. It gets fed straight to a county vet. If it's a really big issue like anthrax, that gets fed up to the national surveillance system. If it's just some kind of low-level issue, the vet might phone the pastoralist and say, you can treat this way, or this doesn't require treatment. Please don't treat with antibiotics. But this has never been trialed with wildlife. And the reason is because there's a very strong bias that only experts in wildlife would be able to report on wildlife health. And so what we're trying to do is break down that perception by recognizing Indigenous peoples have a really, really good potential to report on wildlife health as well. And that if we empower or allow Indigenous people to be custodians of wildlife health, it kind of breaks down this divide between the wildlife conservation sector and the livestock health sector and allows both sectors to work together for a collaborative solution. So our first step with this has been planning how we're going to do this. We want to make sure that anything we develop, an app, for example, can be integrated into national systems. So we're not reproducing what's already being done, and that this system is really cost effective so the government can take it over in the end. The county government is our goal. The next step has been to work with communities to figure out what do they know about diseases in wildlife? How would they report them? What symptoms do they see? How often do they see them? And how do we design a system that allows them to report, recognizing we're working in a part of Kenya with next to no network and also with very little literacy. So we've been quite creative in how we've designed the app. For anyone, I don't know if this is going to work. There. Familiar with participatory epidemiology, there's lots of really fun methods we can use that work well with groups who don't read to help them prioritize what are the diseases we know, what do the symptoms look like, what's most important to our community, which is what the community is doing here. They're telling us with stones what diseases they see most often in different seasons, and that's allowed us to build our app informed by what they see as a priority and how they would describe and report on the symptoms in wildlife. With that information in place, we've now redesigned the app that was being used for livestock. And next month, hopefully, if things go as planned, they'll start reporting using this app. That app will feed to county vet officials and wildlife authorities. And we have a small part of our budget that will allow vets to respond if there's a really big issue. So if you had a herd of elephants showing signs of anthrax, you could start an inoculation campaign in response to the anthrax. This is really where the whole system is going to break down. This is our challenge because although we can see a pathway to integrating the system into governance surveillance systems, the government doesn't have the funds to respond. And there's only so long where communities are going to report disease risk and not get a response, but keep reporting. So this is the breakdown point of the project. We can see that happening. But there's already been some successes. So we've been, piloting the app just to see how it's working. And we have some interesting outcomes. The kind of long-term outcome, which we hope is this incorporation into national surveillance systems where everyday people are involved in guarding wildlife health and livestock health together. So rebuilding these systems of trust between different groups in a really cost-effective and real-time means. So surpassing any way that surveillance is being done in the landscape already with people that don't have to be trained, that just live in the landscape and have personal motivation to prevent disease spread. So that's a hopeful outcome, and we're starting to see some evidence of that. There's been some unexpected outcomes that are really exciting. One is that communities are reporting symptoms in wildlife that aren't yet reported in scientific literature. And they're confident. They know 100% that certain diseases do affect wildlife, and they see the symptoms, and this has never been described in academic literature. So they're identifying new transmission pathways, and that's a kind of unexpected outcome that will come out of the work. There now needs to be efforts to validate that, which is expensive, but they're pretty obvious things. There's some conditions that cause animals to circle and spin. They're parasite conditions that have never been reported in wildlife the communities are seeing. So we're pretty confident those transmission pathways are right. If you can identify new transmission pathways, you can put new mitigation measures in place to prevent spread. So that's quite exciting. It also further validates Indigenous knowledge that people that live in landscapes with wildlife understand the situation. They understand what's going on. They're at the front lines, and they can help us prevent spread. And then the final thing that has not started yet, but we're hoping will, is that as the system's in place and communities are reporting certain symptoms they see in wildlife, Suzanne's team, which is based at a research center in central Kenya, will be able to go collect samples, which will lead to the identification of biomarkers in wildlife. I'm going to not do well explaining this, but in short, a lot of wildlife probably don't present with the typical symptoms we might expect to see in an unwell animal. But if we can use the animals that are clearly unwell to identify those biomarkers, we can start to figure out if animals that don't appear unwell are also spreading the disease. I hope she's not listening because this is recorded, is it? Okay, it's well explained. Okay, all right, good. Thank you. Yeah, so that's exciting. Again, this can be really, really exciting research that is community-led. It's driven by community members. They're involved. They're at the front lines of the research, and we're just kind of doing the finishing steps, which is really cool. I'll just wrap up here. I've already kind of hinted at the challenges. The main challenge is going to be resourcing. The system we're developing is so simple. It could be used in any type of shared landscape around the world. It can be used without literacy. It can be used without networks. And it has a lot of potential to rebuild relationships that are quite broken between conservation authorities and domestic livestock keepers. But if there's no response, if communities don't feel like their reports are being met with some type of protective measure like inoculation, they're not going to keep reporting. And this is where the system likely will break down. But we'll see. Part of the goal is to produce enough evidence to show that a response actually would be cost effective, that it would prevent an outbreak, which is a better option than allowing an outbreak. So that's one option. The other challenge is honestly been working in an interdisciplinary team that has very different interests. At the end of the day, part of the team is there to conserve wildlife, and that's what they care about and that's what they love. And I love wildlife too, but the other part of our team is really, really focused on protecting people and ensuring social justice for people. And those interests really play out in our team dynamics. They play out in meetings in Kenya across all different sectors. And that's really challenging work to do. I think that the amount of time you have to spend like stepping into someone else's shoes in these types of settings, I wasn't expecting. It's really hard to see things from other people's perspective, and it requires being quite humble in order to make these teams work. And we're still very much learning. It's not always been easy, but it has been a good learning experience. I think I'll wrap it there. Thank you so much.
There is a bit of time for questions. Is it actually working? Still red. But this one should be okay. Oh, yeah, never mind. Any question? Yeah, over there.
Oh, hello. Yeah. Thank you so much, Charis. That's fantastic. Just a basic question. In your title, the transdisciplinary action research. What exactly is that? Because I want to look into that. And I'm like, is that something that just encompasses a lot of the different approaches that you have, or is there a particular model? I don't know. Yeah. Like, what is that?
So the transdisciplinary is because we are interdisciplinary, but we also have people across sectors, which is really key. We can't do this work without vet authorities saying you have permission to do this, or wildlife authorities saying the same. So transdisciplinary is interdisciplinary plus outside of academia across sectors. And the action is that all of our learning is coming from doing. So we only figure out what's going to work in terms of novel methods of surveillance through actually doing them with communities. I mean, I think it's just a fancy way of saying we're doing like engaged research with communities, but yeah.
Thank you very much. It was a brilliant presentation. I think you touched on it at the end with your final point, but I was just wondering if you could speak to maybe the skills or particular responsibilities when facilitating work with very diverse communities with different interests, potentially in different countries or different environments. And, you know, should that be something that is strengthened within interdisciplinary research? Did you give some, is that the University of Nairobi, or, you know, that facilitation role is so key. And I just wondered maybe, if you could speak more to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really good question. And I should say I'm the one standing up here today, but definitely the project would not be working at all in any capacity without a very strong group of young Kenyan researchers that are based at the University of Manchester that are playing a really essential role as effectively knowledge brokers and enabling this to work. So Suzanne's lab's been really good at recruiting Kenyan researchers. We now have a Kenyan postdoc, and then we work with Kenyan students at the University of Nairobi. And it's probably hard for them because they are doing a lot of translation between us and Kenyan academics, Kenyan vets, to ensure that everyone understands what's going on and why, particularly around our university processes and what we can and can't do. But I hope that this ends up being a really, really good career experience for them because they get to do this. At the same time, it's probably a really challenging role to have to be doing this constant knowledge translation between this very, very diverse group, both in terms of disciplinary background, interests, language, culture. So all I can say is we are really, really lucky to be supported by amazing ECRs that are filling this role.
Two next speakers. You already moved. Magic. So I'm not sure who is who. Okay. So we have two speakers to show us everything about mosses. The picture is quite interesting. I guess that is actually not real one, but plastic, but, okay. Real cover. Perfect. Okay. So my notes, which actually mentioned, so both of you are from humanities, if I'm correct. Yeah. And with various experience in different fields, and only Anke has this plant humanities that was intriguing for me in terms of what's the remit of plant humanities, but yeah. Okay, perfect. So here is the project, and the title is Moss Worlds. So 2 microphones, I guess.
Thank you. Does that work? Yeah? Is that okay? Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Anke Bernau. This is my colleague, Ingrid Hansen, Aurora Fredrickson, who's the third PI on this project. Sadly, couldn't be with us today. Our project is called Moss Worlds, and unlike most of the rest of you, Ingrid and I are based in the School of Arts, Cultures, and Languages, and I don't think there's always a huge representation from our school in these fora. So it's really fantastic to be here. Because our background is in literature and Aurora's in cultural geography, we come from a slightly different perspective as well. And we are very interested in the question of interdisciplinarity, which we'll talk a bit more about today, and what it means for us as researchers coming from arts and humanities to be contributing to these conversations with other collaborators where the arts and humanities, which are not the social sciences, which have a more obvious connection maybe to some of the work that's happening in sustainability, how we can contribute and what we do in this space. So Moss is a passion of ours, I think it's fair to say. it is weirdly under-researched in a lot of different disciplines, and we found that out through this project. So that was really exciting. It's been impossible to find an expert in mosses, a bryologist, to help us with this project, for example, because it's considered a very difficult training. They're a very difficult plant to study. But mosses, of course, are hugely important, not only because they're one of the most ancient plant forms, but also because of their carbon storage capacities and the fact that they are a keystone species and are very important for habitat building. So we are interested in longer histories. A couple of speakers talked about history a little bit. We'd heard about the miners' strike. We're interested in an even longer durée history. So we're interested in the Industrial Revolution. We're interested in Manchester as the center of the industrial, or one of the centers of the Industrial Revolution, and the connection of that history to what is happening today and what is happening in the future, what could be happening in the future, and mosses are the lens through which we look at that. Mosses also allow us to connect urban biodiversity questions and the rural areas around Greater Manchester, because of course mosses are landscapes as well as plants, and that's why we have the word moss in so many districts of Manchester, like Moss Side, is because they used to be certain kinds of landscapes, but are no longer. So we're looking at all of those areas, and Ingrid will say a bit more about that in a moment. In order to look at this question of moss, we assembled we wanted to be as diverse as possible. And as you will see there, we brought together 7+. I say 7+ because we've had a few people join since we started. So as word started getting around, we had a couple of colleagues join us from MMU, for example, and elsewhere who are interested also in these questions. We have people from literature, music, archaeology, geography, cultural geography, as well as physical geography, environmental biology, microbiology, and green infrastructure planning. Some of these colleagues are academics as well as artists, but we also have artists involved in the project, artists who have been working with moss as a medium in order to address particularly questions about community and climate change in urban environments. We have a curator of botany from Manchester Museum Herbarium, Rachel Webster. She's fantastic. Some of you might know her. She is a member of our project. We have Oliver Hughes, who's a technical manager at the FIRS Environmental Research Station as part of the project. And we have the artist that I just mentioned. And I will hand over to Ingrid for the second slide.
Okay, thank you. I'll move down to it. Can you hear me all right? Is that okay? Is that carrying? Okay, so we're going to talk, as Anke said, we'll talk a little bit more about the question of interdisciplinarity and how that's working and why that matters in this project, but also starting from our own perspective, I guess, as literary scholars and scholars as kind of the interactions of literature and culture. We're really interested in stories, and we're really unashamed about the significance and importance of stories. The narratives that we tell about things culturally shape the way in which we respond to them, shape our understandings, shape or interact with in a two-way kind of cycle, the sort of science that we do, the questions that we investigate. So we're interested in this project in kind of restoring moss in these three particular ways. I don't know if I can make this. Oh yeah, there we go. That's it. I can see a smaller slide here, but it's all right there. So we're examining how the botanical story of mosses, that is biology, has participated in and contributed to the political forces shaping industrial Manchester from the, so we're starting with the project at this stage in Manchester. Manchester is so important to the story of mosses, not only because it's built on mosses, but also because it's here that the draining of mosses, which was seen as central to the project of modernity and progress, really sort of takes root from the draining of Chat Moss just outside Manchester for one of the really early railways, the first timetabled railway. It necessitated the draining of Chat Moss and the kind of discovery of the science for how it was possible to be able to put railway lines across a peat bog like that. So we're looking at that kind of the ways in which the kind of botany of mosses has contributed to has interacted with politics. We're also tracing how the botanical and political worlds that come into being around moss co-evolve with a powerful aesthetics. And we've said that both shapes and is shaped by ethical concerns or values. If you go back to Victorian period, which is the period on which I generally work, if you do a quick survey, for instance, of the Manchester Evening Times, which is a newspaper that changes its name from Manchester Times, Manchester Examiner and Times. But if you have a look through there's an awful lot of writing about moss and mosses. And some of that writing is about a kind of aesthetics that sees moss as A, associated with kind of death and decay, or B, that sees moss as small and delicate and in some ways insignificant. But there's another strand of thinking that identifies kind of the power of moss to take over, or in language I think maybe we want to revisit, colonize new areas. That's something that moss does. So we see all those kinds of ways of thinking about moss, particularly associated with the aesthetics, associated with its smallness, but its spread, associated with, its botanical capacities and the way that it looks, because it's often, at its most beautiful when it's wet and green, and all of those kinds of aesthetics can be put to the service of a kind of ethics or politics, which suggests that what is small, that moss is kind of small and humble, and that to follow that sort of small and humble way was seen as something in the Victorian period particularly suited, for instance, to women. So moss becomes associated in a way with women, as well as being associated with death. So we're kind of thinking about that, and the way in which those stories that we tell now, of course, we'll all be familiar with if you go for a search about moss on the internet. Thankfully, you find quite a few positive stories these days, but you'll also find adverts for moss killer, how to get rid of moss out of your lawn, how to get rid of moss off your roof. The sense that moss is also, so it's also associated with kind of something that's invasive, that's creeping, that people don't want. So there's a kind of aesthetics that says it isn't beautiful in some way, and therefore must be got rid of, or it isn't useful. And in a sense, that's one of the things about moss that we're interested in, that it can't very easily be instrumentalized. It can't easily be eaten or turned into things. And in fact, there's a great 1872 book by Frances E. Tripp, who's a bryologist, detailing varieties of mosses. And in her introduction, she says, don't take moss and dry it out and put it on a hat because you think it's beautiful. So there's a kind of analogy there with the Victorian kind of move to stop people putting dead birds on hats, which they thought was very beautiful. And by changing the story about that, by recognizing that there's a problem with that kind of view of beauty, there's a sort of change in practice and in understanding of human and non-human relationships. So, and the third thing we're doing is really developing a shared research methodology for this restoring that will speak to the moss's place in the city today, how mosses might be useful. We're thinking about the uses of moss in the kind of sponge city movement, and the ways that identifying and understanding and seeing mosses, because that's the other thing about mosses, is that they're easily overlooked and ignored. There's 1,000 species of mosses in Britain, and people are very rarely aware of those. So we're thinking about the ways in which kind of developing our understanding of that in all sorts of different ways might have potential to change the ways in which people respond to the power and the importance of moss in biodiversity and all sorts of other ways.
Okay, so far we have had 2 workshops. So we thought we'd spend a little time just talking about the workshops, what we've done, what we've learned in those workshops. It's a very open-ended project, and someone else mentioned earlier today that experimenting is part of seed corn funding, one of the benefits. And we are definitely experimenting, and that's partly because none of us is, in a sense, a moss expert. And it will be hard to know what, apart from a bryologist, of which there are not many, who is a moss expert. But this is also a really enabling, exciting space, because we are learning a lot together and we're learning a lot from one another. So the first workshop, this is the plan of our workshop and events, will be 4 workshops. Each workshop, we are pairing a humanities scholar or an artist with a scientist or a science-adjacent colleague. We are deliberately running our workshops in relevant locations, so the herbarium, the Frozen Environmental Research Station, the geography labs, in order to think about the spaces in which we do our research and which we don't always share, of course. And then we are presenting in a range of different venues. These are community project venues that we're being asked to talk in. The National Trust has asked us to speak, the Lancashire Wildlife Trust. So we're reaching out to community groups as well who are interested in this work, who are trying to train up volunteers to do moss IDing and things like that. and we're hoping to have a final exhibition. So the 2 workshops we've had so far, the first one was an introductory one for the whole team about natural and social histories, and Ingrid will talk about the second one. And the introduction was divided up, each workshop is divided up into 2 sessions, and the first one was run by an ecologist from South Wales, and I'll say a bit more about Joey in a moment. And the second was run by a colleague from music who works on improvisation and play as method, and we made music to mosses. So Ingrid, do you mind passing on? So I've given you a few quotations because we asked each of the session leaders both to say what they wanted to do, what their aim was for the workshop, but also to reflect on how it had gone for them. Because being paired up, it turns out, is really enriching, but what came out of that as well was that people often felt quite vulnerable because they weren't sure how their work would be received by a group that was so diverse. So Joey spoke to us about natural history. He talked about the ecology of mosses. He also said a little about the social history, and then we had Henry in the afternoon where he made instruments that were based on the forms and structures of mosses that he brought in. And then from what we learned in the morning about mosses, we were asked to improvise pieces around the associations and the facts, the scientific facts that we associate with mosses. And here we have their comments as well, that Joey felt that he said he was quite nervous when he came in because he wasn't sure how a room full of academics would respond to something that he felt was quite specific knowledge. So he was very taken with that, but he also really loved the combination of working with Henry because he said that in his role as ecologist, he often deals with members of the public where he has to explain his work. And he says that he felt he wasn't trained to do that properly. And so to have that interaction with the more sensory, embodied, relational aspects of work in combination with his more scientific work was really productive. And I think what Henry says is quite important there as well, that basically it allowed him as well to feel that he was being heard as a researcher and had something to contribute to what might otherwise be seen as a more strictly botanical or scientific question. Do you have the next ones? Yeah, I won't spend too much time on this. This is the reflection we had at the end afterwards. So Joey felt that basically we focus so much in science on the side of knowledge that measures and defines a given thing, and we don't necessarily talk about how we experience that which we are studying. And he felt that was really valuable. Whereas Henry felt that within the academy, with its complex hierarchies and contestations of ways of knowing, it was important to have these moments of rubbing together and seeing what might come out of them. Right.
All right, so I'm just going to talk very briefly about the second workshop, which we called Restoring the Archive. And this was run by Dr. Rachel Webster, who's the curator of botany at Manchester Museum in the morning, and Dr. Abby Flint, who's a poet and an archaeologist in the afternoon, and who works with poetic methods. So she thinks about her research questions through poetry, and she was introducing us to the ways in which we might do that. So Rachel noted that helping people, what she wanted to do in the morning session was to help people to have encounters with real and tangible things that can physically represent knowledge, theories, or concepts. And she noted the potential in what she called the accidental archive that develops in collections like the herbarium. For instance, and you'll see just down here, I've got how to make a good income with small capital. You will profit by reading the contents. That is a moss envelope. So for people who collected mosses from the 19th century onwards and sent them into Manchester Museum from its opening in the second half of the 19th century, people collect mosses in any piece of paper they had to hand. There's a particular way that you fold it over, so you keep the little small moss sample safe inside. You might keep it in your own collection, and then you send it off to the museum so that it's stored once you've identified it and you've identified where it is. So this is part of that extraordinary and really interesting accidental archive. And of course, in Manchester and its environs, when lots of people are collecting mosses in the 19th century, many of them are involved in the cotton trade or in getting things ready for shipping or their sort of business or industry country people. There's also a whole tranche of working class moss collectors, and that's one of the kind of political stories we're interested in telling, is the ways in which working class moss collection runs alongside middle class moss collection. The British Bryological Society, first of all, began with a kind of professional branch for people who were in professions and a sort of less professional branch, and in the end it realized that it had to bring them both together, and essentially that was a kind of working class and middle class separation which was changed. So the morning we looked around some of these lovely objects, the moss packets, moss slides in the museum, thinking about the ways that they had come there and what they signified. And in the afternoon, Abby Flint offered an invitation for people to experiment with poetic approaches to thinking and writing with moss and archival materials. So we took some of those moss packets and responded to the mosses that were in them. We took some writings from bryologists from the 19th century and just used their words from which to generate poems of our own, to see how that kind of thinking might appear to us if we used poetic methods to think through it. And we took particular species of moss, each of us took a particular one and responded to that in writing as Abby directed us. So what have we learned so far? And I'm using here again, coming back to a quotation. I've borrowed a quotation from Professor Giles Johnson, who's one of our project team, who's a plant physiologist. And he wrote this: as a scientist, I don't use words as an art form. Writing is for communicating, usually complex ideas in the simplest words possible. And as you can see, he goes on to say, I'm not even sure that I knew what a poem was. But if you want to go to our website, Moss Worlds, I can't remember what the end of it. Anyway, Moss Worlds, you'll see the poems that he produced. And what I like is that the last bit of what Giles said, the poem I was inspired to write, if I'm allowed to call it that, allowed me to focus my thoughts on the details of that small spiky plant, but again took me back to the forest where it grows. So there's both a kind of botanical interest there, which is informed by Giles's own academic and professional background, but it's also recognizing the kind of vulnerability that we all feel. And I just borrowed those 3 points at the beginning from some of the blogs that Anke and Aurora and I have written in response to these workshops. I'll come to engage generatively in a moment. Take risks. And I just want to say that what I mean by take risks is take intellectual risks. There's a brilliant kind of research being done about the way that the difference between creative confidence and creative behaviors is often bridged by a willingness to take intellectual risks. And that's what we want to be doing in this project. And then we want to pay attention to botanical detail, to material histories, all of those things I've put there. And for those of us who are coming, Anke and me, coming from a kind of literary background, we're always paying really close attention to words and to the ways that they work and to what's going on behind them. So learning to do that in relation to moss as well has been a really lovely experience for us and has forced us to bring different kinds of attention to bear across our different disciplines. So our output so far, we've got the Moss Worlds website, do have a look. Collective musical improvisation, here are some of Henry's instruments that he made. The poetry that we have all, with varying degrees of trepidation or confidence, produced. A co-written article that Anke, Aurora and I are working on about narratives of moss. And we're putting together with a whole group of us from the project conference paper. And then our RA is working on a history of the Firs Moss House, which was has been there since the 1920s, the Botanical Research Centre Moss House, but its history has not really been documented. So those are the things that we're working on so far. And that's the end of it. So I've gone on to somebody else's discussion. Thanks very much.
Any questions? Comment? Yep, over there.
Hi guys, that was a wonderful presentation. So, as an urban geographer myself, I'm quite interested in the socio-political implications of like the landscape and whatnot. And my question is, as moss becomes like more popular in say like green architecture, how does its commercialization sort of impact or contribute to gentrification, would you say?
Yeah, I think that's a really brilliant question. And there's been quite a lot of work recently about that, hasn't there? About how the whole idea of kind of living walls and green roofs and moss, and also the kind of connected polluter expansion of polluter feeds into that. And I think from what I've read, and maybe you know more about this, it's sort of an open question at the moment how that does contribute. And I'm even more interested in finding out exactly the role that moss in particular plays in this regard, because I'm not even sure how useful a green roofing plant it is, for example, as compared to sedums and things like that. But certainly what you find if you look online very quickly is a host of kind of eco-design companies in New York and other places like that. And what I'm interested in is also how the moss is sometimes killed off or preserved in certain ways so that you can create indoor green living offices and spaces. So it's gentrification in a different context, perhaps, where you can then make claims to sustainability and greenness, but actually the plants that you're building into the space are dead, or just, you know, you might as well have plastic plants, really. So I think it's a really interesting question also how it connects into the explosion of moss use and terraria in horticulture, and the whole kind of houseplant industry is another really interesting related question. The urban RHS, which was the first urban RHS show that they ever did at Manchester last year, had a moss stall where people had gathered moss and was selling them for terraria. It was the most successful stall they had in that whole show. And that's to do with various changes in aesthetic design that are becoming very popular, coming over from China and Japan. So there's all sorts of interrelated issues there that feed into commodification and gentrification, I think. That's not really so much an answer as a kind of response to your question.
And just to add to that, I think that's where the question of attention, which is a word that we just use so easily, don't we? But attention, you know, it has its origin as well in to attend, to wait, to be with. And if we can pay kinds of attention that aren't simply going, oh, great, moss, let's bring some into a building and make it lovely, but actually attend to all those different historical stories, botanical stories, as well as aesthetic stories, and start to sort of shape those. And that's partly why we're focusing so much on that lovely idea of attention with all of its implications of time and closeness and detail and interconnection.
Thank you. Yeah, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the differences between working class moss collection and middle class moss collection, and if you think, based on the answer you've just given to the last question, if there could be a contemporary revival in moss collection, indeed, if there is.
I'll start with that. Definitely, I think there is a contemporary revival in moss collection, and I think there's all kinds of questions about, you know, how it's possible to do that, whether it's possible to do that ethically, etc. The middle class and working class thing is simply the story that there were lots and lots of, and this has been beautifully documented actually by Anne Secord from Cambridge. It's really worth reading about working class botanists of all stripes, not just, she's not specifically interested in moss collectors, but working class botanists and moss collectors across the late 18th and early 19th century, collecting specimens from around Manchester and Lancashire specifically. This area saw a real kind of flowering, people who would be, you know, working in the mills during the day and going out after work. There's a lovely piece in Elizabeth Gaskell's novel, Mary Barton, where an old man is going out moss hunting in the evening, Mary Barton's grandfather. And so that sense that people were going out collecting mosses, identifying them. Leo Grindon, whose work is in the Manchester Museum, writes about them too and says, in no scientific society in London was there more knowledge than there was in these societies of mainly working class men. One of the things I'm interested in as well is what were working class women doing, and I'm sure they had a role to play, but the documentation is mainly about working class men, and they were meeting in pubs to talk about their stuff, whereas things like the Manchester Lit and Fill, which was a more kind of middle class society, was giving a platform to middle class collectors who were talking about them there.
Yeah, the other thing to add that Joey told us about was that in that time, there was also a reference to the middle class collectors, or the educated, the trained collectors, if you like. They were tier 1 collectors, and the working class collectors were tier 2 collectors. And then the tier 2 collectors got increasingly independent and decided they didn't need the tier 1 so much. and they were producing such innovative research that Tier 1 had to turn around and say, oh, okay, we do actually have to engage with this knowledge production. So there's a really interesting shift around. And then in the more contemporary context, what's interesting is that a lot of mosses, not so much as lichens, which were really badly affected by urban air pollution, but mosses too. Many mosses disappeared from city centers and didn't come back until after the mid-50s, when you have Clean Air Acts coming in. So there's also there's a lack of knowledge about the importance of mosses in urban biodiversity contexts. There's been a lot of research done in Spain. That's a real hotspot for that kind of research, but not a lot in the UK, for example, which seems crazy considering how many mosses species there are in the UK. But we know that they're very, very important for urban biodiversity in suburban gardens, for example, precisely because they are sort of habitat builders and creators. So that's another area of research that we're hoping in the future we might bring in to join into this as well. I mean, the other thing we didn't talk about was that Manchester Museum, the largest proportion of its collection is mosses, and they come from all over the globe. So we're also interested in the future thinking about those global connections, those collection histories, those histories of empire, and then maybe thinking about communities in Manchester today and different languages for moss, because we know they live in every ecosystem in the world. So it's something where you could do something really interesting around the very local that we're doing now, connecting it to more global questions and contexts.
Sorry, I'm afraid. Thank you very much to all the speakers. And now moving to the panel discussion.
Thank you so much.
When it's ready. Oh, no,
All right, we'll just let the panel for the final session get themselves down. So, congratulations for lasting the whole day, and thank you. This is the last session, and what I think the plan is to do, that I've been asked to chair, is to sort of bring together or get some of the people who've been involved in some of these projects, but to focus in on the question of interdisciplinarity, what we mean by it. My question, if it was to Anke and Ingrid, was that quote from the plant physiologist, which was like, I'm a scientist, I use words, I try and say complex things as succinctly as possible. And I thought, isn't that what poets say they do as well? Right? So it's like, at what point do you have these moments where you could have really good focused moments where, oh, actually we are trying to do the same thing, or we are saying we're doing the same thing, but actually it means something radically different in practice. But anyway, so I think that's part of the function of this last wrap-up session, focused on the challenges of doing interdisciplinarity in environmental studies research. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to ask the three panelists to speak for 3 or 4 minutes on how they see that question. They all come from different backgrounds. I'll introduce them in a second. And then we'll generate a conversation, and we'll have a bit of time for questions at the end as well. So anyway, so I think I'll just I could ramble on, obviously, but Anke Bernau you've already met recently in the previous panel, who's in Salk in English literature. Gareth Clay is in the geography department as a physical geographer. He spends as much of his time as possible up on peat moors, I think. And Tom, straight in front of me, McDonald, is over in Faculty of Science and Engineering. And so we've got people across different bits of the university speaking to this question. So we'll go from left to right, if that's okay, from Anke.
Yeah, be sick of me. Right, I think, I guess I'm a medievalist, so that sounds like a confession, doesn't it? So I work on medieval literature and culture. That's the period of about 1200 to 1500. Originally, that's my training, and that's where I've done a lot of my work. It's inherently interdisciplinary in the sense that we do literature, music, art history. So I've always been interdisciplinary in that way, I guess. But it wasn't until a few years ago when a colleague who had an UMRI project on peat landscapes asked me to be part of it and wanted me to do, I guess, a bit of an environmental history contribution to that. That I suddenly thought, oh, actually, I could go further afield than people who are ultimately in the same school as me in arts, languages, and cultures. But there was, for me, a mental barrier to doing that because I guess there are several different reasons for that. But for me, I worked on eco-criticism for a long time, but working in that space of environmental history and plant humanities is different kinds of ways of thinking about plant-human relations. And that's a field that's been developing over the last 10 years, maybe. It really opened up doors for me, and I suddenly got talking to different kinds of people that were further afield from where I normally strayed. And that really was made possible through that initial UMRI experience. And I think one of the big barriers for me was, even coming here today, I'll just be very open about that, is when you come from our kind of discipline and you listen to the kinds of disciplines that present in these fora usually, they're very concrete projects. They're very empirically focused often. They have very clear outcome or intended outcomes or things they want to find out. It's often much harder for people in our disciplines to do that, because really what we try and do is we try and open stuff up to questions. We try and open up rather than find a solution. So it can feel very intimidating to be in this space, because it can feel like, well, this must just sound really weird or pointless or whatever. And I think one of the great things about that project is that it allowed us to have conversations across different disciplines and hear that other people can feel similarly. And also that was, as you were saying, Matt, doing that poetry exercise, I was really quite nervous when we went into that. I thought, how are some of the scientists in the room going to react to that? Are they just going to hate this? And we had some really amazing reflections come in afterwards where people were saying, I was really nervous about this, but nobody was dismissive. And also suddenly seeing that what we do with words, what we do with attention often does enrich what each of us does and does speak to each other. And so I think those little moments were really important and made us also more willing to take risks. So just to go to three things, I think, for interdisciplinary research that I think are important. And I'm basing this on the work of a French philosopher called Yves Sitton, who wrote a book called Ecology of Attention. And he says the three things that we need to work together, and he's talking here about working across activists and politics and academics, but I think it's true of working within academia, is we need attentive listening. So genuinely listening to each other and not thinking you know what it is you're going to hear, which is what I was doing when I thought I knew what scientists might think about the kinds of work that I do. Pluralist concern, which means even if what the other person is saying about that topic sounds like it's coming from the weirdest place or is just wrong, not to close off your attention to that, but to keep listening and to keep going beyond that, and recognizing as well that it doesn't matter if you don't share all the same ideas anyway. Having some tension in that project is a good idea. And then most fundamentally, the advance of trust. I do think you need trust to do this kind of work. And I do, because also you can fail, and it might not lead anywhere, and we don't know how this is going to go. We still feel very much in the middle of things. And I think that is also very hard in certain institutional settings. It's easy to say, take those risks, take that time, but we're all quite time poor. And it also depends at what stage of your career you're in, I think. So there's all sorts of institutional issues there.
Thanks, Anke. Gareth.
Thanks, Anke. I might come back to some of those points later on. So, when I was asked to do this, and Matt kind of gave us a few prompts to think about the challenges about interdisciplinary environmental research, that we've talked some about them already today, about flexibility, about trust and getting the team together. I think the ultimate one there is about having extra time, more time than you think you need to get those teams together, whether it's time, resources, and talking about language and approaches and those kind of things. I think that flexibility and willingness to try something new is really important. I think I've seen too many teams go, can't do that. I don't do your thing. So I think that's really important to kind of foster and support and to kind of generate within your team. I think my kind of, just talking about my journey, I guess, in interdisciplinary research, I started out as a geologist. I was already set to go into the oil and gas industry, go and look at structural geology. I really loved the kind of the technical side of things. But my PhD was all around heather burning in upland moorlands. I changed tack in my PhD, and I was actually funded by, at the time, the Rural Economy and Land Use Programme. Some people might remember that. It's going back a few years, which was an explicitly cross-council call between ESRC and NERC. And I was very much a physical scientist, very much kind of coming at it from understanding processes in peatlands and carbon and all that kind of stuff. But I was actually funded by the ESRC randomly. I was the only ESRC-funded student, PhD researcher in the science faculty at Durham, which I thought was weird. But as part of that, I did some interdisciplinary training, and it's the number of exercises that I did in that training that I still remember today. I didn't use a huge amount of them in the PhD, but I do come back to it. It's about, I think earlier on, Charis, you were talking about kind of definitions of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research, and that exercise, those workshops really still stick with me today. And I think part of that is being open to try something new. You go, actually, give it a go, see how it works. If it doesn't work, so be it. I think the one thing that holds us back, though, and a bit of a reflection / provocation, is that, and you kind of mentioned about kind of career stage, and this is where I was going to pick it up, is that as an early career researcher, in whatever discipline you are, you're looking for promotion. You want to get off probation, get off your fixed term contract, onto promotion, all that kind of stuff. And if you look at the promotion criteria, I don't think there are many specific criteria around interdisciplinary working. You're in your discipline, you're in your unit of assessment, you're in your department generating outputs in your discipline. So I think one of my kind of calls to action internally at least, but generally, is how do we recognize early career researchers who are trying interdisciplinary approaches within things like probation, promotion criteria. So I think that's something to maybe reflect upon today. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Gareth. Tom.
Cool. Yeah, I think quite a lot of points have already been covered. So I'm just going to pick up on maybe two that I think are considerable challenges, actually. And I think one is that often when you work at the interface between two different disciplines, is that you often aren't going to have novelty on both sides of the project. Because if you design an interdisciplinary project that has novelty on both sides, the risks of that project actually failing are very large, because you've got that barrier you've got to cross, and then you've also got the challenges in both disciplines. And so when you have a project that you've got to frame it in this sense, you often end up having a project that has novelty on maybe one side and something very routine on the other side, or vice versa. Or sometimes actually something that's very routine, maybe or reasonably routine on both sides, and the novelties at the interface. And I think the challenges this presents are actually a few-fold. So one, it actually becomes very hard to get funding for this, because if you go for funding in a certain area, if I go to the EPSRC, they want to see novelty on the physical sciences side. If you work with someone in biology, they want to be able to show novelty on the biology side. So I think that adds complexity. And then it's also then about publishing the work. So if you've got something that's truly interdisciplinary, it's hard to find the reviewers. And actually, this is also on the publication, but the grants, it's hard to find reviewers that have the expertise to span across it. So they might just look at one side of the project and just be, that lacks like true novelty on that side. So recognizing that when the novelty sits at the interface, which is what most interdisciplinary work is really about, in my view, this actually is quite a big barrier. I think that for a sector or for an academic research, it's hard with our research councils primarily.
That's great. Thanks. We'll open out in a minute, but I'll maybe ask a couple of follow-up questions just to push some of that. So one, I mean, you've all identified, I think, in some ways. I mean, Gareth talking about promotional process, you just talking about things like reviewers in journals and so on in particular. about obstacles to interdisciplinarity or tensions within our institutional constraints that make that difficult. Even while we know in lots of other contexts, it's pushing that way. Otherwise, we would not be having events like today, or all of this unrefunded that's incentivized it. And one of the things there, I think, is, I said this in an email as a provocative question, right? Is there a certain sense that we've got excited about interdisciplinarity for its own sake? That there's something funky going on. Like there's something novel at the interface, but actually the other stuff's like, we could have done the other stuff without that interface. So there's something exciting about bringing a poet and a plant physiologist in the room together for its own sake. And I totally agree that's true. But in a way that the institutional incentives from funding councils to become interdisciplinary or various other mechanisms that have pushed us in this direction, they're also quite separated out from substantive problems that we might want to do research about. Like the current UKRA cross-disciplinary call, it's like entirely object-free. The goal is to get interdisciplinary teams. We can define our own goal. We have to do that. But the goal for them is simply to get interdisciplinarity for its own sake. So I wonder if we end up looking for things that, because it enables us to do interdisciplinary funky things, rather than necessarily saying, well, I want to do research about this and therefore. And does that sort of, so I wonder if there's a sort of reaction to that sort of issue, or maybe it's not a problem, but it's obviously also going along with the constraints that you talked about that make it difficult.
I think that's a really interesting question. I think if we focus obviously in the space of sustainability, I'll come back to that actually first. So just to mention on the UKRI one, obviously that call was hugely oversubscribed, wasn't it? I mean, we had an internal screening process, and I mean, Helen, I wouldn't want to put you on the spot, but I think the success rate through that was low, wasn't it? In terms of there was a lot of applications and not many went forward. No. Okay. No was the answer. So I think that there's obviously a huge interest in this. And if we come to the space of sustainability, I think it's quite clear that we have to have interdisciplinary work, because to solve challenges in the sustainability space, you can't do it in a single discipline. I do a lot of research on plastics recycling, plastics sustainability, circularity. You can't solve that by just doing better quality recycled plastic, because you then have to understand how are the public going to interact with that material. Is it going to be effectively sorted and separated? What's the economics around it? How does the supply chain interconnect with this material? Is there the infrastructure in the society to actually handle those materials? And so I really think from a sustainability perspective, you have to cut across normally more than two disciplines, I think, to really have a project that's going to have outputs that are going to drive us towards more sustainable future.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that that's true even if I take an aspect of that is more discipline specific, like environmental history. If I want to look at bioarchives as well as social archives, I understand a social archive, I can do texts and images, but I don't necessarily know how to deal with bioarchives. So then I need people who can do archaeobotany or whatever, and can explain that to me. With plant humanities, it's the same. previously you had people working on eco-criticism, whatever, and you had people working on more scientific approaches to plants. But if you want to think about how environmental change happens in relation to plants, if you're thinking about things like the spice trade, even going back historically, you can't do it in isolation. You have to do it together. And you need to understand also a basic level of scientific language. So I have had to learn a new vocabulary if I want to do work in that space. And I think that's true of colleagues in other disciplines as well.
Could I just really quickly come in? I guess one of the other things I forgot to mention that's really key as well is that for us doing kind of physical sciences, again, if we're pushing sustainability, we need to drive new behaviors in society, and therefore actually interacting with channels such as artists and people who are specialists in communication, how to make that information engaging and compelling to people is really key from our research. So connecting into humanities, again, is I think a big opportunity to help drive better engagement.
Yeah, so on the question about whether we focus on interdisciplinary research too much, I don't think we do. I think in order to deal with these challenges, as everyone else is saying, we need to bring disciplines together. I think, though, in this room, we're all sold on that. We're all at a conference talking about interdisciplinary research. We're all members of platforms and institutes and so on. So I guess the challenge is for those people who are not in the room, which is the vast majority of the university, how do we get them on board with the idea of interdisciplinary research? How do we convince them that whilst they might be in their disciplinary specific area for all good reasons, that they might want to engage with an aspect of or all of the interdisciplinary space that the university offers? So I think we're preaching to the converted today, which is brilliant. It's nice talking to our mates and our people that we know. But I think the challenge for the platforms, the institutes generally, is how do we encourage others to embrace the interdisciplinarity? Maybe it's a language issue, maybe the term interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, all that kind of stuff sounds a bit too highfalutin. Maybe there's something about challenges, maybe there's something about how do we, I don't know, work together. But I think there's something about how we get others on board that aren't already in the room today.
Cool. I don't disagree. But I think the tension is partly because there's a number of things for me going on in this tension, and I'll maybe open it up into the room. One is that some sorts of discipline, you talked about risk, Anke, and that the sorts of project that you were doing are really risky in the sense that you're putting yourself in a situation where you go, I don't know if I really know what the hell I'm talking about now, or this person's going to think I'm an idiot. And that is highly risky. And partly that's, if you like, not all forms of interdisciplinarity are the same, right? If I go to an ESRC application as somebody in a politics department and have somebody who's a sociologist on my team, now that might be classed within the ESRC context as interdisciplinarity, but that's pretty soft. Right, the boundaries between politics and sociology, or a human geographer. If Charis is still around, or Heather is on my, in a project. Actually, the substantive differences in there's not actually very much complicated sort of methodological or ontological work. If we can't use highfalutin terms, who can? That conversation is quite easy, right? That's not. Whereas talking to a poet would be very different, or talking to a biologist, right? So I think it's partly that some of those things feel more, if you like, organic because some disciplines are nearer to each other than others. Talking to an economist, apologies to the economists in the room, they're really hard to talk to, But that's, even though politics and economics might be sometimes thought of as quite separate, quite similar, actually not really. Actually, in practice, very different. But then that does mean that some of that rationale for why we get brought together is because of changes in the funding environment and the opportunities that creates, and institutional pressures to do that, even though there's contradictions because the promotion procedures haven't caught up. It's sort of partly coming from that. There is a sort of cart-horse relationship that's not always about the needs of this project are because I need to bring in these people on because I don't know how the supply chain works. So anyway, we've only got 5 minutes left. So do you just want to come on?
Just a question about the whether some forms of interdisciplinary that thing are more difficult, tough, complicated. Maybe. I think there's an element of articulating the reciprocity between the disciplines. How do you show that there's a benefit going in different directions? I think going back to the funding, though, I think the funders, whether that's internal or external, need to trust us when we're doing collective, risky projects, that something might not work. And I think that's a challenge for us as people applying for funding, but also people sitting on panels, is do we have confidence that that team will try a good thing? It might not work, but you've got confidence in the process, even if the outcomes are not yet specified. So I think there's a lot of trust that goes into interdisciplinary research, both within the teams, but also how we fund it and who does the funding. Sorry, I just want to jump in on that.
No, it's cool. We've got 5 minutes left. So if there are questions or comments on this sort of general theme of the challenges of interdisciplinarity, it would be good to hear from people. Go ahead.
I mean, from my perspective, I would say what you've just said highlights a real asymmetry in academia. So as someone from an arts background, if I bring a scientist into it, it's just assumed there's value because science is valuable, full stop. So, I do think it shows the asymmetry. I think it would be much harder, maybe, I don't know what your feeling is, but it might be harder for a scientist to be able to say, well, bringing a poet on board is actually, but maybe it wouldn't be, and I'm wrong about that. But certainly I don't feel that with that collaboration, I think that's very much the arts and humanities feel under pressure at the moment. And I think being able to collaborate with people in the sciences is seen as something desirable.
I'm just thinking, yeah.
I guess again, I'm trying to make it a bit more abstract so I can maybe try and answer that question because it's a really interesting and challenging question. I guess the outreach part is really key, isn't it? I think where we can do things into the other disciplines and then that allows to make it more relevant to a wider audience outside of disciplines, then I think that is a big opportunity there. I think, when you're pitching work to a completely different discipline or it's not in their interest area, then I think that's always hard though from all sectors, isn't it? Mm. Because we all look for things that are relevant to us, to our expertise, our knowledge. I'd love to hear if someone has a solution. I'd love to hear it.
I would just say on one bit of it, which is also a thing that Gareth raised, on the promotion question, that feels like that ought to be soluble, right? We ought to be able to generate a process. In part, it's a process whereby heads of department and heads of schools would have to be sort of basically told, there would be either means by which there's a pathway for getting that recognition of interdisciplinary value into those school and faculty processes, and or mechanisms that mean that a head of department who is discipline obsessed doesn't have a veto power over your ability to get promoted, right? The more complicated ones are things like ref stuff, where it's cross-institution, and therefore there's a sort of complex system interdependence that we can't, as a single institution, control. I had a paper in Nature Climate Change in the last ref cycle, and it didn't get included in the ref. Long story short, but it was the single most looked at paper by the various ref evaluators, and I was on this team as well. I was on the ref outputs team, and in the end we said it was like, it was basically a fairly straightforward, obvious juggle, right? Is this a political science piece of work and going to get valued by the ref team who are discipline specialists, or is it nature and therefore, right, should be in? So there was a sort of quite complex discussion there, and this wasn't about promotion. I was already a full professor or whatever. I had no vanity stake in it. It's fine, but it was quite a good illustration of how those systems that you can't control at the level of an institution intrude on that valuing of interdisciplinarity. Gareth, sorry, you were going to come in.
If I've got time, I'm looking at the watches over there. So on that point about kind of valuing interdisciplinary outputs, we talked about ref and promotions and all that kind of stuff. I guess there's kind of an intrinsic kind of you as a researcher, what do you want to do and what's the value from it and the process, and again, whether it's an outcome or a process, and that's important to recognize. I guess the other thing to think about here is are you, and this is, if I've got a moment just to kind of preface this, I was doing a PhD examination recently. It was over in the Netherlands with opponents, multiple people. And I was chatting with one of the other opponents, and the candidate was working in transdisciplinary approaches and kind of working on a particular issue, working with practitioners and different disciplines. And the candidate kind of made a claim that they are a transdisciplinary researcher. Brilliant, fantastic early career researcher. But one of the other opponents said, well, no, you're not really a transdisciplinary researcher at this stage. You are a disciplinary expert who works in transdisciplinary ways. And again, this is something to think about, is are you a disciplinary researcher moving into those interdisciplinary spaces, or do you want to be an interdisciplinary researcher who can apply your facilitating skill set, for want of a better term, in a range of different areas? And that I don't have a reflection on, but it's something to maybe talk about. But I think in terms of that kind of promotions and support and how do we do it, I think Matt's right. It's kind of how do we change the mentality of when it comes to senior leaders, and no names in the room, of course, about the value of interdisciplinary research. So not an answer, I'm afraid, but a reflection.
Well, that wraps this almost last session up, and I think we now hand over to Steve to wrap us up, just for the last 5 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I won't keep you long because I know literally the bar is open, so that's good to hear. Yeah, I've been tasked with summing up the day, which is an almost impossible task since it's been so varied. But I've made some notes, and I thought I'd list the themes we've listened to today, which were space, games, fly tipping, textiles, biomanufacturing, mine water heat, net zero housing, global crises and climate policy, zoonotic disease, and biology. I don't think there's many conferences where you would have a group of talks as varied as that. But I'm a geographer by tradition, and one thing that I really liked was the scale, the difference in scales, from the hyper-local, talking about fly tipping in Greater Manchester, all the way up to African wildlife and biodiversity, and then into space. And I did a kind of very unscientific sort of tally, sort of survey of different cross-cutting themes that we heard, and the sort of top 6 were around whole life approaches, finance and funding, wildlife and biodiversity, barriers, resources, and then the leader was legislation and policy. So maybe that's something to think about. I'd also add that that's enormous, the broad range of themes. Perhaps not only you wouldn't see it at a conference often, but in many universities you wouldn't see such broad range of research. So I think that's something to think about as well. I'm not going to go through each talk, but I really enjoyed all of them. Mike called us geeks earlier, and I am a geek, and I love space and video games, so it was great to kick off with that. Thanks to Matt for giving me some hope that Donald Trump wasn't going to destroy the world. And I grew up next to an abandoned colliery, so it's good to hear that maybe one day that could provide net zero heat. It also only remains for me to say that we have a feedback form. If you scan that QR code. Thank you to Henry Voice Institute, Mary, the SCI, and most of all to Alex and Yingru, who made it all happen. So thank you, everybody.